My son told me to leave his engagement party. Those words still land in my chest like a stone. I can remember the scrape of my shoe against the ballroom marble, the way the jazz quartet saxophone folded into the chatter, and then his voice, quiet, almost embarrassed, but perfectly clear. "Mom, would you please go?" It was not just the words. It was the room, the way people turned, the bright white roses, the soft light catching on crystal. For a few seconds I felt both impossibly old and suddenly invisible. "My name is Charlotte. I am 73 and I live in Ohio. I lost my husband, Robert, 3 years ago. He was an architect, a man who drew things correctly the first time. Houses, plans, a life that felt solid. When he died, he left more than memories. He left me papers and a pen, and a trust that he insisted be well written and tight enough to protect the three of us. Him, me, and our son, Daniel. He was practical that way. He knew I worried, and he knew how easily people could be swept in by charm and the glare of parties. He wanted a safety net. He wanted discretion. He wanted a clause, tucked away, that would help if someone tried to pull the family apart. So when Daniel asked me to that party, his engagement party, I thought of Robert. I thought of the many Sundays we had all spent together. Roast on the table, Daniel in his old spot, his laughter filling the kitchen. I thought of how we held on to small rituals because they kept us tethered to each other. I did not expect that tether to be tested in the middle of a ballroom. Before I go on, if you're watching this and it matters to you, tell me where you are. Drop your city and state in the comments. I like knowing where people are sitting when they listen. It makes me feel less alone telling this. You should know up front that I am not looking for sympathy or for a courtroom drama. I am telling you what happened, because maybe someone else will see the small things, the minute changes, before they become a crisis. I am telling you this because sometimes protecting the ones you love looks harsh at the time, and sometimes you have to let a lawyer speak where a mother cannot. But I get ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. Robert and I married young, not foolishly, but with a kind of surety that felt unshakable. He sketched houses, and I made them livable. He loved clean lines and good books. I loved gardens and a steady Sunday roast. We worked together. We saved. We traveled when we could. We argued, as all married people do, about money and retirement and whether the living room should be painted robin's egg blue or gone with a safe gray. When Robert became ill, he faced it with that same clear-headedness. He planned. He wrote things down. He wanted our son's future to be shaped by love and sense, not by sudden panic or the predatory kinds of arrangements grief can attract. He and I met with our attorney a few months before he went. He was precise about the trust. He wanted the trustee to have discretion when things smelled wrong. "Make a clause for undue influence," he said, and he laughed a little at how dramatic it sounded. He didn't like the word undue. He preferred the phrase safe boundaries. But it was there, the way a smoke detector sits on a ceiling, quiet until needed. He tucked Section 4.7, see into the document, a provision that allowed the trustee to restrict distributions if they reasonably suspected undue influence upon a beneficiary. It was legalese, neat and unromantic, but it had a purpose. When Robert died, I think Daniel felt unmoored for a while. He was in his 30s then, a good man with a friendly laugh and the tendency to overwork to soothe things he couldn't fix. He visited. We cried together. For the first year after, we became very close. He came over for dinner almost every Sunday. He and I would sit with tea after dessert and talk about nothing and everything. He still called me sometimes in the middle of the night when the house felt empty. I suppose I felt needed. I suppose I liked that. Then he met Vanessa. At first she seemed like a pleasant woman. Polished, yes, and confident in a way that made her stand out. She had a marketing job in town and a smile that seemed practiced in all the right places. She liked our antiques and said all the right things about the house. We invited her to dinner. She brought a vase of tulips and a story about a gallery opening in Cleveland. I welcomed her. I wanted Daniel to be happy. The first small thing that made me hesitate was her taste. Nothing wrong with taste, of course. But she had an eye, always for the decorative, as if the house itself were a portfolio. She commented on the china, catalogued our furniture, and once asked, half joking, what we would do with the house someday. "It's such a lovely old place," she said. "So many options." I felt something tighten, but I told myself I was being foolish. After all, weddings need planning, and conversations about heirlooms are normal. The second thing was subtler. She began redirecting conversations. If Daniel mentioned a plan to renovate the spare room, she would suggest a contractor who was a friend of her cousin's. If he talked about investing an inheritance, she would suggest a great opportunity with a calm assurance that seemed rehearsed. At first, these were suggestions. Then, they became expectations. Dinner nights became shorter, interrupted by texts. Sunday roasts became less frequent because Daniel was often running late or working on something with Vanessa. He started missing my birthday brunch. He stopped being the one to call me just because. It happened in 1,000 little ways. Vanessa commented on the value of things as if we were considering them parts of a balance sheet. She liked to talk about status. She compared neighborhoods like someone cataloging pieces for a collection of living rooms. Once, at a family get-together, she laughed at an old family photograph and said, "Doesn't that look quaint?" As if nostalgia was a kind of costume someone put on and then discarded. I felt a sting. I told myself to be gracious. I told myself that people are different, that I'm of an older generation and she's younger, that my sense of household was perhaps more sentimental than practical. Then came money. It always begins with a small thing. Vanessa asked Daniel if they could borrow a bit for a business venture, a trip, an investment. She framed it as temporary. He said yes. The amount was not enormous in the grand scheme, but it was significant for us because Robert's trust was meant to be a steadying force, to pay for a roof when it needed repair, to keep the house in order, to provide a measured safety net. The requests escalated from, "Can we borrow for this?" to, "Wouldn't it be great if the trust could help with our down payment?" The tone shifted from casual to entitlement. It was not just the money. Vanessa began to push Daniel away from long-standing rituals. She made little jabs about our habits. "Sunday dinners are sweet," she told him once, "but it's a lot of obligations." Later, she would not come, citing work. She asked him to skip family events because it's a weeknight. She criticized the way our furniture was arranged, suggested we were living in an antique museum, and implied that we were clinging to the past. I remember feeling a cold knot in my stomach when she told me, politely, that the house might be better used as an investment property. Perhaps I misheard. Perhaps I was old-fashioned. There were other moments. She asked for access to certain accounts, not directly to our trust. She never asked that. Instead, she suggested that Daniel take control of household financial matters, while we handled other things. At times, she showed a strange interest in Robert's old drafts, the way a person admires a designer's portfolio in order to learn where the value is kept. I told myself not to be paranoid. I told myself to be grateful when she brought flowers. It is important that you hear this. I never once accused her out loud. I asked no one to side with me. I watched, I listened, and I kept my voice low because Daniel was my son, and nothing I wanted should make him feel attacked. That fear of pushing my child away made me quiet. Many mothers will tell you the same. We keep our opinions folded into little notes we never hand over, because the risk of breaking a relationship feels heavier than any loss of temper. The turning point came at the engagement party. We had agreed to a modest celebration at the country club here in Ohio, a place with tall oaks out front and an oak-paneled ballroom inside. The country club sits on a small lake. You can see the light shimmer off the water from the windows. There were white linens, a local jazz quartet in the corner, and white roses arranged so the room smelled faintly of spring. People from both sides of the family were there. Vanessa wore a dress that made her look as if she'd stepped off a magazine cover. Perfect hair, heels that clicked on the marble. Daniel was smiling. I was proud. We had all sat through the toasts, laughed at the stories about Daniel as a boy. The evening felt like it should have been ordinary and sweet, and then something happened that made me feel smaller than I had any right to be. Vanessa told a story. It was supposed to be a joke, a little quip about moving on and new beginnings. But the story included the house. She let the audience laugh at a depiction of me as a nostalgic woman clinging to old things. She mimed my pruning of roses and poked fun at our china. People laughed politely. I smiled. Because what choice do you have at such a gathering? You outwardly play the part you're assigned. Inside, my face felt hot. Later, as people drifted to the bar, Daniel stood and leaned toward me. I expected a whisper of affection, a smile of protection. Instead, he said quietly but with a firmness that made me flinch, "Mom, would you mind stepping outside for a moment? It's getting a bit—" He looked embarrassed, as if my presence might spoil the arrangement. The room was full of their friends, and suddenly I felt like a relic at an exhibit. I remember the sound of my shoe on marble as I left. The air outside the country club that evening smelled faintly of cut grass and lake water. Across the walkway, some of Vanessa's friends smoked and talked about honeymoon plans. I stood on the steps, stunned. I had lived through worse things than embarrassment, but humiliation has a way of making skin thin. I felt my hands clench. For a heartbeat, I wanted to storm back in and demand respect. For a longer heartbeat, I wanted to call Robert, to ask what he would do, but he was not there to steady me. I did not cause a scene. I sat on the stone bench until the moonlight felt like an ally, and then slowly drove home. The drive took me through neighborhoods where maple trees arched over the street and porch lights glowed, small rectangles in the darkness. I felt as if I was driving through an old photograph of my life, where the colors had dimmed just a little. That night I could not sleep. I thought of my mother's hands, deft at kneading dough, always keeping orbiting things in order. I thought of Daniel as a child, leaning on my shoulder, watching cartoons. I thought of Robert's plans, neat and exact as blueprints. I thought of Vanessa's laugh at my expense. The world had shifted on its axis. The next morning I pulled out the trust documents. They were in the chest in the study, in the same place Robert had kept them. A leather portfolio, the pages still crisp. I had never wanted to pry. The trust had always felt like a promise, not a weapon. But there are moments when you must learn what your guarantees actually protect. I read slowly. Legal documents are not poetry, but there is a stern logic to them. They tell you what you can do when you need to do it. There it was, Section 4.7c. The words were plain enough for someone to understand if they read them without fear. The clause allowed the trustee to limit distributions if there were reasonable grounds to suspect that a beneficiary was the victim of undue influence, that is, being pressured or manipulated into decisions that were not in their best interest. In layman's language, if someone was steering my son into choices that served someone else more than him, the trustee could require extra oversight or halt distributions until the matter was clarified. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the morning sun warming the worn grain of the wood, and feeling the slow, heavy fall of decision. The clause was not a threat. It was a tool. Robert had put it there, likely imagining circumstances where the family's future could be compromised by charm masquerading as love. I had promised him, in his better days, to look after Daniel. I thought of that promise then, a mother's devotion that sometimes has to be stern. I did not, and I will not, pretend that legal mechanisms are moral swords that cut clean. They are not. They are dry instruments that help buy time. They give you a pause. They let you step between a rushed choice and a well-considered life. I understand that calling a lawyer sounds dramatic to many. I understand some will bristle at involving courts and contracts in family affairs. But you must also understand what it feels like to be told you are unwanted at a moment you thought was sacred. There are times when to protect the heart you love most, you have to act outside the usual tenderness. So I called Paul. Paul had been our family attorney for nearly as long as Robert had his practice. He was steady in the way my husband was steady. No theatrics, no grand declarations, just measured competence. When I reached him, I told him about the party. I told him about the way Daniel had spoken to me. I told him about Vanessa's increasing interest in our affairs. I told him we needed to review the trust. He did not promise anything. He did not offer to save me or to punish anyone. He listened with that same calm patience. He said plainly that the trust had a clause we could consider, and that his role would be to execute the documents exactly as they stood. He told me the clause allowed the trustee to require written approval before distributions if there was a reasonable concern about undue influence. He suggested we take a look at the recent interactions, the requests for money, the changes in Daniel's behavior. He mentioned that locking the trust was an option the trustee could exercise, not as a punitive measure, but as a protective one. Those words, locking the trust, sound harsher than they are. It can mean simply that distributions are paused or made contingent on approval. It can mean an extra layer of care. It does not mean take everything and run, as some imagine. It means put a pause on the autopilot so the person being pressured can be heard, sheltered for a moment from momentum that might sweep them into a choice they cannot later undo. After I hung up, I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. I held the document in my hands as if it were a small, warm animal. I thought of Daniel's face outside the country club, of his hands when he was little, dirty from playing in the garden. I thought of how easy it had been for me to be silent because I loved him. I also thought about how hard love can ask you to be, to place a difficult boundary, to let someone be angry at you for a season, to stand firm in a way that hurts in the moment, but may heal later. At the end of the day, I wrote a note to Paul and set a time to come in. I wanted him to simply explain the options. No spectacle, no threats. I wanted to know how the mechanism worked, what it actually did, and what it would look like in practice. I wanted to know whether this clause, which Robert had included perhaps thinking of some far-off problem, could help me now. Before meeting him, though, there was the small matter of the immediate aftermath. The party had not been some private wound. People had seen. There were messages later from acquaintances asking awkwardly whether I was all right. I received a few that made me cry because they were kind. I received a few that made me angrier because they sided with Daniel solely on the basis that he was a man making an adult choice. It occurs to me that the last thing many people want to do in a family fracture is to take a measured stand. People prefer to pick sides quickly. I did not want to feed that instinct. A few days after the party, Vanessa called the house. She spoke sweetly and I answered as usual. Her voice over the line was like polished silver. She asked about the curtains and the dishes, and then asked casually about the plans for the house after me. I tried to steer the conversation back to light things. She persisted. She asked if Daniel had mentioned that I was hesitant about moving forward. I answered as evenly as I could that these matters were private family decisions. She laughed softly. "Of course," she said. "We're just excited for the future." It struck me how often people would mistokened certainty for virtue. Confidence sells, Polished language can make a suggestion feel inevitable. I began to catalog the moments: the joke at the party, the lunch where she suggested a contractor, the small request for an advance. Individually, none of these were damning. Together they made a pattern. I met Paul the following week. He had a small office downtown, with a map of Ohio hanging behind his desk and a stack of legal pads in a drawer. He was precise, the kind of man who unpacks problems into manageable boxes. He said he could act as counsel for the trustee, that he could make a formal review of recent distributions, communications, and any evidence that there had been undue influence. He explained that undue influence, in plain terms, is pressure that overwhelms someone's free will, not the romance of someone simply being persuasive, but a kind of calculated pressure that moves a person away from their own interests. I asked him the question every reasonable mother asks: will this hurt him? Will this push him away? Paul looked at me, and for the first time I saw something softer in him. He said, "Charlotte, whenever you bring law into family, there will be discomfort. The point is to buy clarity. We are not putting up walls because we want to hurt. We are putting up a guardrail to prevent a car from running off a cliff." I let that image sit in my mind. I thought about cliffs and guardrails, about the absurdity of having to choose between being loved and being right. Paul suggested a cautious first step: review the ledger of distributions, document the requests, and prepare a formal notice that the trustee could exercise Section 4.7c if appropriate. He warned me not to be cavalier. He emphasized that this was not about depriving Daniel, but about ensuring his decisions were free of pressure. He advised that any action be explained gently to Daniel, with love, and that we keep the channels of communication open. Legal steps should never be a substitute for conversation, he told me. He said that sometimes a legal instrument creates the space for a real conversation to take place. When I left his office, I felt oddly buoyed and wholly exhausted at once. We had a plan, but plans are not guarantees. They are at best scaffolding. I drove home through neighborhoods where people raked leaves and children bicycled along curbs. The ordinary domestic life continued as it always does, even when private storms rise. That night, Daniel called. I was on the porch, the late light thinning into dusk. I could hear the occasional traffic hum from the main road, the distant bark of a dog. He sounded tense. He asked calmly whether I had spoken to Vanessa about how things might work, and whether we could perhaps support some flexibility with the trust while they made the transition into marriage. He did not mention the party. He spoke of help, like it was a friendly thing we could all sign off on together. I told him carefully that I loved him, and I wanted what was best for him. I told him that moments of pressure can come in the most unexpected forms, and that Robert had been explicit about protecting against undue influence. I told him I intended to have Paul look at a few things just to make sure decisions were being made for the right reasons. I tried to say it without accusation. There was a long silence on the line. I thought for a moment he would argue, that he might feel betrayed. Instead, he said quietly, "You're making me choose." I felt my throat close. That was not what I wanted. I wanted him to feel supported, not cornered. I wanted him to understand that love sometimes holds firm. He said, "If you're going to make me choose, maybe I don't want to be pressured to be with someone who—" And then he stopped and exhaled sharply, as if the air itself were difficult to pull in. I could hear the muffled sounds of his life on the other end. Dishes, perhaps a television, or the constant hum of someone building a future. "I don't want you to pick me over anyone," I said, and I meant it. "I want you to make a choice that's yours. I want you to be happy. But I also want to be sure the choices are yours." We did not solve anything that night. We did not mend the breach. We only aired it, like a tent flapping in the wind, temporary and uncertain. I knew then that letting Paul respond was not an act of triumph. It was an act of stewardship. It was, in its essence, an attempt to protect my son from being rushed into a life decision by forces he might not fully see. I also knew it would not be pretty. There would be anger. There would be silence. There would be people who would not understand how a mother could choose an attorney over a son. But what I did not know, and what I feared, was how Daniel would react when the legal measure materialized. Would he see it as a shield or as a blade? There was another thought, too, more painful and private. What would Robert have wanted? He had written this clause not out of paranoia, but out of love and cautious realism. He had expected that someday someone might try to take more than they gave. He had wanted to protect the family's legacy so that what he worked for could be stewarded with care. I felt his absence sharply then, like a missing rhythm in a familiar song. In the days that followed, I documented what I could. Dates, requests, texts that raised an eyebrow, the shift in Sunday dinners. I did not keep these things as trophies of hurt. I kept them as facts, necessary pieces in the sober business of protecting a life. I made a list of small moments that were easily dismissed on their own, but when viewed together formed a pattern. The suggestion that the house be repurposed, the emphasis on status at the party, the repeated requests for financial accommodation framed as temporary and helpful. I folded the list into the same leather portfolio that held the trust. One afternoon, as I sat at the kitchen table with my notes, I found myself flipping through an old photo album. There was Daniel at 6, with a gap-toothed grin and flour on his nose. There was Robert holding up a blueprint, smiling with the half-smile he reserved for me. I traced those images with my finger and whispered apologies I did not know how to deliver. I had never imagined a day when protecting my son would feel like isolating him. Perhaps that is the cruel calculus of parenthood. To guard someone you love often asks you to be the least popular person in the room for a while. I reached out to one of my sisters, not to complain, but to find some perspective. She reminded me gently that choosing boundaries is an act of love, not cruelty. The hard things are sometimes the truest things, she said. I held that like a small, bright stone and told myself to breathe. There was one more moment I will not forget. A neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, who had known Daniel since he was a boy, stopped by with a pie. She told me quietly that she had seen the party and that she had a sense something was wrong. She held my hand and said, with the blunt kindness of someone who had lived a long time, "Sometimes, Charlotte, you have to be the steady hand. You have to be the one to say no, even when it hurts." Her voice was worn like a comfortable coat. I felt steadier for it. And then, on a rain-damp morning, I made the call that set everything in motion. I dialed Paul's number, feeling the weight of the portfolio on my lap and the warmth of the cup I had forgotten to finish cooling beside me. I told him I wanted to proceed with caution but with purpose. I asked him to look through the recent requests and communications and to advise on whether Section 4.7c should be exercised. He asked only for clarity and documents. He asked that I trust him to act with discretion. He promised not to turn my private family into a public spectacle. He said he would draft a letter to the trustee outlining the concerns and that any action would be framed as protective, not punitive. I felt my hands shake slightly as I hung up. I did not know then whether I had made the right decision. I only knew that I had to do something before momentum took a life that my son might later regret. I also knew that the next steps would force choices. Choices for me, for Daniel, and for Vanessa. They would reveal who was in this relationship for love, and who was in it for what love might bring. At the kitchen window that afternoon, looking out at the maples and the slow movement of clouds, I thought about the many ways people show up in our lives. Some come with songs, some with plans, and some with quiet intentions that steady us. Some arrive with cloaks that conceal motives. The challenge is learning to tell which is which before the melody has played us into a corner. I had set the wheels in motion. I had spoken to the lawyer and gathered the facts. I had, in my quiet way, chosen to let an instrument my husband had insisted upon do the talking he could no longer do. I told myself repeatedly that this was not betrayal. It was protective love. But the ache remained. I thought of Daniel sitting on the steps outside that ballroom, and I wondered whether he would ever forgive me for the moment I turned to legal counsel, instead of only to him. That evening, as I prepared a small meal for one, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number, a photograph from the party, Vanessa smiling with her arm around Daniel, the caption, "Can't wait for forever." I looked at the image, at the brightness of the smile, and realized that the story was not going to be neat. It would be messy, human, full of stumbles. It would require patience and stubbornness, and an ability to hold both love and protection in the same hand. When the phone rang again, it was Daniel. He sounded shorter this time, as if the conversation that had been paused now pressed against a new seam. "We need to talk," he said. I agreed and told him I loved him. He came by that evening. He did not come alone. He came with Vanessa. They stood on the front porch. The porch light haloed them in gold, and for a moment I thought it would be a return to the way things had been. They stepped into the living room where Robert's plans hung framed on the wall, and where the tea kettle still sang sometimes. The air between us felt taut. Vanessa greeted me with a smile. She was cordial, perhaps even warm. She spoke about wedding colors and venues with such ease it could have been rehearsed. Daniel looked at me with a mix of shame and something I could not name. I made tea. We sat. The conversation started politely. At one point, Vanessa mentioned an idea about selling the house after we moved. Her voice was light. I felt the old tightness in my chest. I remembered then why we had the clause. Not as a way to prevent a marriage, but as a way to ensure a life was built from free choices, not calculated nudges. I had not yet acted. I had only gathered facts, and yet already the air tasted like impending rain. Daniel finally spoke in a small voice. "Mom, we're not trying to take anything without asking. She just—" His words faltered. I reached out and touched his hand, the same hand that used to grip mine in the grocery store when he was scared of thunder. I told him I loved him and that I wanted him to be happy. But I also told him that I had noticed a pattern of suggestions and requests that made me uneasy. Vanessa's eyes flashed for the briefest second. It was not anger, but surprise, an almost indignant look that said, "Who are you to say?" I felt my heart hammer. There was so much at stake. A relationship, Robert's legacy, my son's future. The walls seemed to close a little. That night after they left, I sat with the trust on my lap and the photograph of Daniel at 6 on the table. I could feel the tension and the impending decisions like a current under the floorboards. I had done the sensible thing, the calm thing. I had called Paul. I had asked for a measured response. But I also knew that measured responses can still upend lives. The question that kept visiting me was the very one I had feared. Would my son understand why I had done it? Would he see it as a protection or as a betrayal? I finished my tea and sat in the dim living room, listening to the house settle. There are moments in life where you understand that love sometimes asks you to be the harder person. That is a lonely place, but perhaps it is also the place of keepers, the people who stand in doorways and watch storms pass, keeping what is dear from being swept away. I went to bed that night with the portfolio under my pillow. An old, silly superstition, perhaps, that if I kept the trust close, I could sleep easier. I turned off the lamp and tried to breathe. Tomorrow, I thought, I'll bring the documents to Paul, and we will plan the next step. Tomorrow the lawyer will speak for a moment the mother cannot without risking everything. But tomorrow would come with its own complications. I did not know who would feel wounded or who would walk away. I did not know whether Vanessa would reveal intentions I could not know now. I did not know whether Daniel would call me a meddling mother or would understand that sometimes to love is to intervene. I fell asleep with those questions spinning like dust motes in the beam of the hallway nightlight. When I woke, the world was quiet and ordinary in its small mercies. The mailman making his rounds, the soft chime of the neighbor's doorbell, a robin tugging at the lawn. The everyday continued. The drama of our lives had its private theater. I dressed and sat for a while at the kitchen table. The trust spread out like a landscape of clauses and signatures. I had read Section 47C 100 ways and could explain it to you in plain language. It allowed the trustee to step in, to pause distributions, to seek written approval before funds were released, when there was reasonable concern that a beneficiary was under pressure to make decisions that were not their own. That was the legal mechanism. The human mechanism was mercy coupled with firmness. That was the part that kept me awake. I picked up the phone and dialed Paul. My fingers were steadier than I felt. I told him I was ready to move forward, cautiously. He said he would draft the notice to the trustee and prepare the necessary steps, but he reminded me gently that every legal instrument is only as humane as the person wielding it. He told me to be prepared for initial anger and to hold the door open for conversation. Let him know you love him, he said simply. Let him know why. Hold fast in compassion. I nodded, though he could not see me. I set the phone down and looked at my hands. They are old hands now, with lines like river maps. They have made bread and mended socks, planted bulbs in the spring and ironed collars. They have held Daniel when he fell. They have steadied me when grief came. They would have to act now as instruments of protection. When I walked out to the car to run a small errand, the day seemed bright and ordinary, yet I carried with me the knowledge that a legal letter was being drafted, that an attorney would soon speak for a mother who sometimes felt her voice too small in a world that rewards sparkle and certainty. I felt a mix of dread and resolve that sat in my chest like a small bird, fluttering and unsure. I would learn, in the days to come, how others would interpret that act. I would learn what Vanessa would do when she realized the trust was no longer on autopilot. I would learn whether Daniel would blame me or understand. But for now, I had done what I thought was necessary. I had let my lawyer respond where perhaps I could not. That is where the story sits for the moment, on a hinge. The lawyer was preparing to act. I had called him. I had my reasons, and they were tied up with love and fear, and a desire to honor what Robert had built. There was no going back to the way things were before, not without conversation, not without healing. The next steps would test the bonds between us. When I closed the front door that afternoon, I did not know yet how wide the fracture would be, or whether people would find their way back. I only knew that I had set in motion a response that would, in time, reveal the truth of intentions. I could only hope that what was revealed would lead us back, perhaps changed, perhaps bruised, but intact. I put the kettle on and waited for the water to boil. The house hummed softly. Outside, the maples whispered in the wind, as if urging patience. Paul sent the letter the week after I signed off. He did it the way he'd always handled difficult things for our family, quietly, precisely, with no flourish. I remember opening the mail that day and seeing his neat envelope with my name typed on the front. Inside was a short, formal notice to the trustee, explaining the concerns we had documented and referencing Section 4.7c, the clause Robert had insisted on. There was no accusation in it, only a request for caution and an outline of the recent requests and unusual communications that had prompted our worry. You should know what locking the trust felt like in practice, because the phrase is harsher than the reality. The trustee responded by putting distributions on hold, pending written approval. Not forever, not as punishment, but enough to stop the autopilot that might have let a rushed decision sweep my son into something irreversible. Paul called to tell me it was done. His voice on the phone was businesslike and soft. He said, "We've created a pause, Charlotte. That pause is for clarity." That pause landed like an electric stillness in the house. It was a small, bureaucratic thing with enormous consequences. The world rearranged itself in the spaces legal paper makes. People who prefer momentum to reflection bristled. People who value caution nodded. The immediate result was what you might expect, an eruption of emotion followed by a period of stunned silence. Daniel learned of the trustee's action the same afternoon. He called, and the calm he had been trying to maintain broke like thin ice under his feet. "Who did this?" he demanded. His voice carried the hurt of someone who felt ambushed. I tried to meet him with softness. I told him the truth, that I had asked Paul to review the recent pattern of requests, and that the trustee had exercised discretion under the clause Robert had left expressly for moments like this. I said I was trying to shield him, not punish him. He did not hear that in the beginning. He heard only the cold fact of paper and the heat of embarrassment. For a day or two, he was furious. He accused me of not trusting him. He accused Paul of meddling. He told me I had humiliated him again, and this time with the law. I sat with that, let him speak, and tried not to reply with the defensiveness his anger deserved. I remembered his boyish voice and the way he would fall asleep in my lap after a fever. I remembered the blueprints Robert used to scrawl on, tiny margins of instruction that became the architecture of our lives. Vanessa responded differently. She called with a tone I can only describe as clinical cheer. She spoke about plans and timetables, about what a delay in distributions would mean for their plans. She began to speak to me less as a mother-in-law in waiting, and more as an obstacle manager. Her language shifted from sweet to transactional in the space of a few sentences. It was then that the pattern, the small things stitched together, became a rope in my hands. There was a moment, in the middle of the storm, when I realized how strange this felt, that an attorney's letter could lay bare a future that had been moving so fast. I had taken a tool my husband made and used it as he likely intended, to slow down a decision long enough for the person making it to breathe. If that sounds cold, I can only say that love sometimes requires a shape that has edges. The weeks that followed were a mixture of heat and thaw. Daniel stayed away at first. He spent nights at a friend's house, on their couch, sleeping with the kind of abruptness that every mother recognizes as avoidance. His calls were few and clipped. When he did come by, he lingered in the doorway as if testing whether the house remembered him. Vanessa's calls stopped being simply cheerful and became sharp. She started speaking of moving plans and of people they needed to speak with, implying subtly that my presence, and now the trust's pause, was an impediment to an inevitable progression. Then, almost as suddenly as the fury had come, Vanessa left. She didn't announce a dramatic confrontation. There was no thrown glass or shouting that would make a good story for gossip. She packed some things into a weekend bag after an argument with Daniel and left town for a few days. Her parents came for a visit, and there were polite conversations about the pressure of wedding planning and the need to respect the couple's choices. I received no grand apology, no public statement. Things simply thinned out. Fewer texts, fewer photos. The bright, glossy presence she had cultivated dimmed at the edges. When Daniel phoned to tell me they had decided to postpone the engagement, his voice had a new note, a tiredness that did not sound like fury so much as exhaustion. "We need time," he said. "We need to figure out what's real and what's momentum." He apologized, then stopped himself, then started again. The apology was not a huge moment of revelation, but a small, honest thing. "I'm sorry you felt humiliated," he said. "I'm sorry you felt pushed out." I told him I understood that he was hurt. I did not say I had been right. I did not say that his now quiet future might have been different had he not been guided into fast decisions. Instead, I told him the truth across the wire, that I had acted out of fear for him and respect for what Robert had built, and that I loved him more than I loved being liked in the moment. He listened. There was silence. Then a long, small conversation that did not solve everything, but began to soften the edges. Vanessa did not return. Not at first. That absence was a kind of punctuation mark. Some people will read that and reach quick judgments. I will not give you the ease of certainty. People leave for many reasons. Some are sound, some are selfish, some are complicated beyond our knowing. Daniel's break with her was not suddenly a moral victory or a tidy ending. It was instead the start of a long, patient repair. We began the work, slowly. He came around more often. At first the visits were tentative. A coffee in the kitchen, a short walk around the block. We spoke without the theater of accusation. He told me, with the shame adults sometimes hide in their jokes, that he felt he had been swept along by the idea of an ideal future, and had not always listened to himself. He said he had been overwhelmed by plans and not grounded in the kind of daily things that make a marriage, the small, ordinary kindnesses and the rituals you preserve together. Sunday dinners returned, though not with the same immediate warmth as before. The first few were awkward. Forks moved slowly. Conversations skirted the edges of what had happened. We started simple. Roast, vegetables, a dessert that needed no ceremony. We talked about trivial things at first. The neighbor's new fence, a recipe I'd tried, the odd behavior of a cat that roamed our street, because real healing often begins in ordinary conversation. Slowly, those dinners deepened into longer evenings. We would linger with tea at the table and sometimes fall into silence, which became oddly comfortable. There were conversations that required courage, about boundaries, about how to recognize manipulation in its quiet forms, about what it meant to be an adult son, and a son still loved and cared for by his mother. Daniel resisted some of those conversations in the beginning. He didn't want to feel lectured. He didn't want to think of himself as naive. He also did not want to be its villain in anyone's story. I tried to hold that complexity for him the way you hold a fragile bird that's been bruised by a window, gently, with a firm hand that also gives space. Sometimes he broke down and cried. He cried over the house, over the memory of his father, over regret that he had not seen, sooner, the subtlety of what was happening. I held him. There were things neither of us could change, the years they had lost, the choices they had each made. What we could do was make new promises, to speak honestly with each other, to consult before agreement became momentum, to ask for counsel when decisions loomed large. We agreed, imperfectly, to build a new rhythm that honored both his autonomy and the legacy his father left. The community, of course, had opinions. Some neighbors whispered about meddling mothers. Others quietly admired the steadiness I displayed. Friends sent meals. Mrs. Hargrove kept bringing pies and shaking her head in that kind way that says, "You did the right thing, even if it hurt." Paul, the lawyer, continued to be a steady voice of reason. He reminded me often that the goal was clarity, not punishment. He checked in, not with legal threats, but with quiet questions about whether we were keeping the channels of conversation open. Vanessa's departure left a ripple. Some of Daniel's friends expressed relief. Others were sympathetic to what she had lost. A few people messaged with platitudes about finding the right person, without understanding the quiet violence of being pushed along by shiny plans. All of this, in its small ways, taught me that social pressure works in favor of momentum. People like to see a story that moves forward. They do not always appreciate the value of a pause. In time, Daniel and I found ways to repair that were both practical and tender. We took up small projects that gave the house a gentle care, a new coat of paint on the back porch, mending a loose stair, making the garden less formal and more like the place where he had learned to catch frogs. We sat on the swing on late afternoons and spoke of nothing and everything. There were apologies that were messy but meaningful. There were promises not fully kept, and then tried again. We attended to the rhythm of friendship that a parent and adult child can have, both companion and caretaker, both independent and interwoven. There were moments of private grief that never fully vanish. I missed Robert every day. His patience, his lines in the margins of the plans he drew, the way he could see a problem and calmly outline the solution. Sometimes I would catch myself reaching for him and find only an empty cup on the counter. There were also moments of gratitude, that he had left instruments in place to protect us, that he had been the sort of man who thought ahead enough to include a clause about undue influence in his plans. If you ask whether the trust saved my son, I will tell you it bought him time. And in that time, he returned to himself. That return was not miraculous and not immediate. It was gradual and often halting. But the pause allowed him to breathe without the pressure of immediate financial temptation. It allowed conversations to replace the momentum of checking boxes and scheduling venues. It allowed him to remember why he loved the small, ordinary things that make up a life. We never closed the conversation on trust or on boundaries. We had hard days where he would remind me he did not like being controlled. I would remind him I did not want to control him. I wanted to protect him from choices he could regret. He would sometimes laugh bitterly and say, "So you chose Paul over me." I would answer, "I chose to do what your father and I promised to do, to be guardians of the life we built for you." Those exchanges were not pretty, but they were honest. They were part of a rebuilding that was real precisely because it had to survive hard things. Time, too, did what time does. The sharp edges grew duller. Sunday dinners became less loaded with meaning, and more simply the rhythm of family. Daniel found work that grounded him and friends who loved him for the person he'd been all along. He grew careful about how quickly he embraced new plans and people. He thanked me once, quietly over a pot of tea, not for winning anything, but for sticking by him in a way that forced him to re-see himself. "It hurt at the time," he said, "but maybe it saved me from a lot of what I don't want." That, in the end, is the complicated, ugly, humane thing about protective love. It hurts the person you love sometimes. It risks making you the unpopular one for a season. It can look from the outside like interference. From the inside, when you love someone with the quiet desperation of a parent who has seen the world's quick illusions, it can look like the only thing that stands between someone and a future they might later regret. I often think of Robert when I walk through the rooms. I imagine him smiling at my stubbornness, at my clumsy insistence that sometimes a legal instrument is not a threat, but a lifeline. He would likely roll his eyes at the melodrama of it all and ask why we let a party make such a thing so dramatic. He would, I suspect, be quietly pleased that the thing he built, his careful claws tucked into the trust, did what he had hoped it would. Gave us space to breathe. Do I wish things had unfolded differently? Of course. I wish we had seen the pattern sooner. I wish Daniel had had the clarity earlier to notice that charm and attention are not always the same as care. I wish Vanessa had chosen differently. But wishes do not rearrange decisions that were made without full sight. We can only work with what remains. Now, 3 years on, there are Sunday casseroles and a garden that doesn't pretend to be perfect. There are long conversations about aging and plans for the house that are practical and humble. Daniel calls me on a Tuesday sometimes when he sees something funny on the internet, and I laugh. And we are ordinary people in a life that has been complicated and mended in ways that make it, if anything, truer. If there's anything I learned through this painful season, it's that loving someone fiercely includes the willingness to do the hard things that may make them angry for a time. It includes trusting that a pause is not betrayal, but a chance for clarity. It includes the humility to accept grudges now and then, and the resilience to keep the table set for when people choose to come back. I tell this story not because I want to be seen as brave or clever, but because sometimes the small things add up and save us from larger losses. If you are listening and you've felt the slow creeps of a relationship changing around you, look for the quiet patterns. Ask questions. Keep a simple journal of what seems odd. And if you ever find yourself in a place where you must choose between being liked and doing what you believe will protect someone you love, know that the choice will probably be harder than you imagine. Before I close, a small request. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Stories, after all, are how we keep one another company through such complicated things. Thank you for listening.